6 in the morning, while Boston still slept beneath the fog, a black car pulled up in front of St. Brendan's Church. The man who stepped out was Ronan Gallagher, a name that could silence the entire harbor with a single mention. People said he never did anything without a purpose, and they were right. But no one knew why the most powerful man in Boston would personally bend down and place a paper bag of food beside a homeless woman sleeping curled up under the church's porch every single day for 6 months, never missing one. Her name was Sadie, 27 years old, a woman who once had everything and lost it all, now holding on to nothing but an old music notebook with a melody she could never finish. She didn't know who that man was. And she certainly didn't know that the paper bag each morning was not pity, it was a debt being repaid in silence. A debt no one in Boston knew about, not even her. Until the day his sister's wedding turned that secret into an earthquake, dragging back a ghost from her past she thought was gone forever, and everyone would have to learn one truth. A person's worth is never measured by where they sleep tonight. If you believe that quiet kindness always finds its way back, please hit the like button and share this story with someone you love. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story that touches your heart. And now, let the story begin. That evening, the Gallagher mansion was ablaze with light for the family's first dinner together in many months. The long wooden table in the dining room had witnessed countless meetings that determined the fate of half the city. But tonight only 4 people sat around it. Patrick occupied the head of the table, Ronan sat to his right, and Tessa and Caleb sat across from them. Ruth quietly poured the wine before withdrawing into the kitchen. She had served this family for 30 years, long enough to recognize the moment when the atmosphere at the table was about to shift. Tessa set down her knife and fork before the main course had even been served. "I have something to announce." She looked around the table, her hand closing around Caleb's. "The wedding will take place exactly 1 month from now, at the resort in Cape Cod. The Whitmores have already sent invitations to everyone on their guest list: senators, judges, the chairman of investment funds. Nearly the entire political and business elite of Boston will be there." Patrick nodded slowly, warmth entering his eyes. "My youngest daughter is about to become Mrs. Whitmore. If your mother were still alive, she'd cry through the entire ceremony." Tessa smiled, but the smile lasted only a second before she turned to her brother. "There's one more thing." Ronan didn't look up from his plate. "I'm listening. Who are you bringing to the wedding?" Tessa's words weren't a question. Ronan set down his fork, slowly and quietly, in the way that everyone who had ever sat across from him during a negotiation understood as a warning that it was time to stop. But Tessa was his sister, and she didn't stop. "I'm serious. This isn't an ordinary party. The Whitmores are a political family. Every camera, every newspaper, every eye in high society will be fixed on this wedding. And you're the bride's brother." Ronan poured more wine into his father's glass, his voice calm and even. "I'll be there. I'll arrive on time, bring a gift, and give you my blessing. Isn't that enough?" "No." Tessa leaned forward. "You're the face of this family. If you show up alone, all of Boston will talk. They'll whisper behind my back that the head of the Gallagher family is 34 years old, and not a single respectable woman is willing to stand beside him. They'll say that, in the end, this family is still something people only dare to fear, not a family they'd ever marry their daughters into." Caleb lightly touched his fiancée's shoulder. "Tessa, I don't think this is necessary." "No, let me finish." She brushed his hand away, never taking her eyes off her brother. "It took me 2 years to make the Whitmores accept me. 2 years to prove that I'm not the daughter of a criminal empire, that I deserve to enter their world. I won't let anything ruin that day, not even my own brother." The dining room became so quiet that the faint crackle of the burning candles could be heard. Patrick set down his wineglass, his voice deepening. "Tessa, you're speaking to your brother, the man who paid for every year of your education, every dress you've ever worn, and the Cape Cod resort you just mentioned. I know, and I'm grateful." Tessa swallowed, but her gaze remained hard. "But being grateful doesn't mean I have to let my wedding become the subject of gossip." She turned back to Ronan and lowered her voice, and it was that very softness that made her words cut the deepest. "I don't need you to truly love anyone. Borrow someone if you have to. Hire someone. I don't care where you find her. She only needs to know how to wear an evening gown, how to hold a wineglass properly, and how to smile for the cameras. Just don't embarrass me." Ronan looked at his sister for a long moment. Something passed through his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something far more exhausted than anger. Then he folded his napkin, placed it on the table, and rose. "I hope you have a perfect wedding, Tessa." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no coldness. He said it simply, like a man closing a door. Then he left the dining room, his steps unhurried, his back straight and solitary as his shadow stretched down the long, empty hallway of the mansion he had rebuilt with his own hands, from the little his father had left behind. Caleb lowered his eyes to his plate, unable to look at anyone. Tessa sat upright, her chin still lifted, but beneath the table, her fingers were twisting tightly together, the gesture of someone who had just won an argument, yet couldn't understand why her heart felt hollow, as though she had lost. Only Patrick continued staring in the direction where his son had disappeared. He said nothing. He didn't offer another word of reproach to his daughter. But in the eyes of that 68-year-old man, who had survived every kind of storm the underworld could summon, there was something strange, as though he knew a secret no one else in the room knew. As though he knew that every morning his son left the house at 5:30, and that the familiar black car never once headed toward the harbor. He took a quiet sip of wine, then spoke to his youngest daughter in the voice of a father rather than a former leader. "You worry too much about appearances, Tessa. Be careful. Some things are far more precious than appearances, and people often don't realize they were the things worth protecting until they're gone." Tessa frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Patrick only shook his head, set down his glass, and gazed distantly toward the dark window. "You'll understand one day." That was all he said. And no one sitting at that table that night knew that only 1 month later, his words would become true in a way that even he couldn't have imagined. It was late into the night when Patrick found his son in the study, where the fire in the hearth was the only source of light. Ronan sat in the old leather chair, his glass of whiskey not yet half empty, his eyes fixed on the flames as though they held the answer to something he had been searching for a very long time. Patrick didn't knock. He simply walked in, poured himself a drink, and sat in the chair across from him, the same chair he had occupied every night 30 years ago, when this house had still belonged to him. She didn't mean what she said. He was the first to speak. Ronan's lips curved faintly, though it wasn't quite a smile. Yes, she did. She meant every word, and she was right. Patrick studied his son. "Do you blame her?" "No." Ronan slowly turned the glass in his hand. "Who could I blame? She only said aloud what everyone in Boston thinks, whenever they look at me. The man who leads the Gallagher family. The man who can bring the entire harbor to a standstill with a single phone call, yet comes home alone every night." He paused, and the fire crackled in the silence. "Do you know, last week I had dinner with a business associate, and he brought his wife. Throughout the entire meal, that woman didn't dare reach for the food. She didn't dare look me in the eye. Her hands trembled so badly that her soup spoon kept clinking against the side of the bowl. I've grown used to that. So used to it that I don't even notice anymore. But when I came home that night, I suddenly thought, I could buy this entire city, but I've never been able to buy a single dinner where the person sitting across from me didn't have trembling hands." Patrick said nothing. He let his son continue because he understood that this man had remained silent for far too many years, and things buried for that long could only be allowed to flow out on their own. They couldn't be forced. "The women who come to me fall into 3 kinds, Father. The ones who are afraid of me. They smile, but their eyes are searching for the nearest way out. The ambitious ones. They look at me, and I know they're calculating how much this empire is worth. And then there are the curious ones. The women who want to know what it feels like to stand beside a dangerous man. But when the thrill is no longer new, they leave." Ronan took a sip, and his voice grew quieter. "At 34 years old, I've never met a woman who looked at me without first looking through the Gallagher name. Sometimes I wonder, if you stripped everything away, the money, the power, the fear this name has planted throughout the city, what would be left underneath for a decent woman to love?" Patrick set down his glass, and the aging father spoke in a voice he had used only when his wife was still alive. "I met your mother when I was far worse than you are now. Back then I didn't have this mansion. All I had were 2 scarred hands and a name written in the police records. Your mother was the daughter of a baker. She knew who I was. The whole neighborhood knew. Yet one winter morning, she handed me a warm loaf of bread and said, 'You look like a man who hasn't had a decent meal all week.' She wasn't afraid. She wasn't calculating anything. She only saw a hungry man." He smiled into the fire. "The right woman won't be afraid of what you are, Ronan. She'll see what you could become. The problem isn't that you haven't met a woman like that. The problem is whether, when you do, you'll have enough courage to let her see who you truly are." Ronan remained silent for a long time, and for a moment, Patrick saw something pass across his son's face, as though he were about to say something, to reveal some secret he had kept hidden for far too long. But then the study door opened, and the moment slipped away. Miles entered with a folder in his hand, then stopped when he saw Patrick. "Sorry, I didn't realize the old boss was here too." Patrick waved a hand and rose. "It's all right. It's time for old men to go to bed." He gave his son a single pat on the shoulder, then walked out and closed the door behind him. Miles placed the folder on the desk, then sat in the chair Patrick had just vacated, with the easy confidence of the only man in the city who would dare do such a thing. "Ruth told me about dinner. Your sister certainly knows how to choose her moment." Ronan didn't answer. Miles watched his employer for a while, then tilted his head. "Honestly, this isn't difficult to solve. Give me 3 days, and I'll find someone suitable. There are several models who've done this kind of work for powerful families before. Professional, discreet, a clear contract, 1 weekend, then everyone goes their separate ways. Beautiful, polished, knows how to hold a conversation, knows how to dance. Even if the Whitmores investigate her, they won't find a single flaw." Ronan looked at his friend, and the answer came without thought. "No." Miles shrugged. "Then what are you planning to do? The wedding is 1 month away. If you arrive alone, your sister will turn all of Cape Cod into a battlefield." "I know. Then why refuse?" Ronan stood and walked toward the window, looking down at the sleeping city below, where distant lights shimmered like a world that had never belonged to him. "Because I've spent my entire life surrounded by things that aren't real, Miles. Loyalty bought with money, smiles bought with fear, respect bought with contracts. My sister's wedding may be the most dishonest day Boston has ever seen, but I don't want the woman standing beside me that day to be something I rented too." Miles sighed, rose, and held the folder against his chest. "Do you know what your problem is, boss? You're the last romantic left in the underworld, and romantics usually die alone." He reached the door, then stopped and looked back. "I almost forgot. Tomorrow morning, you have a meeting with the harbor lawyers at 7 o'clock. "I know," Ronan replied without turning around, and Miles, who had walked beside him for 12 years and knew better than to ask why his employer always refused every appointment before 7 o'clock in the morning, merely nodded and closed the door, leaving the most powerful man in Boston standing alone beside the window, in the middle of that vast study, as lonely as a king inside a castle with no queen. At 5:30 the following morning, while the entire mansion was still submerged in darkness, the black car quietly rolled through the gates. Ronan drove himself, with no bodyguards and no chauffeur. It was the one rule he never explained to anyone. The road from the wealthy neighborhood down to the old district took less than 20 minutes. Yet it felt like traveling between 2 different worlds. Iron fences and carefully trimmed lawns slowly receded, giving way to rows of aging red brick buildings, and at the bottom of the hill stood St. Brendan Church, its gray bell tower motionless in the mist. He parked in the same place as always, across from the side entrance, turned off the engine, and sat still for a few seconds before stepping out, as though completing a private ritual. Beneath the church portico, the woman was already awake. She sat with her back against a stone pillar, an old blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, and an open leather notebook with a worn spine resting on her lap. A short pencil moved slowly across the page. Sadie didn't look up when she heard his footsteps. She had learned their rhythm long ago, steady and certain, not hurried like someone rushing to an early shift, and not dragging like a wanderer with nowhere to go. "You're 2 minutes late today," she said, her eyes still fixed on the page. Ronan placed a paper bag on the stone beside her, the warmth of the freshly baked bread still seeping through the brown paper. "A fallen tree blocked the road in Quincy," he replied, and she gave a small nod, as though it were a serious explanation for a serious appointment. That was how they had spoken to each other for the past 6 months, in short sentences, with no clear beginning or end, yet as steady as the church bells striking 6 o'clock. He had never asked why she was there. She had never asked who he was. And within that silence, within everything they chose not to ask, there was a kind of respect they both understood. The respect the world had stopped giving her from the day she fell to the bottom, and had stopped giving him from the day he climbed to the top. She opened the paper bag. Along with the loaf of bread and the container of soup, there was a pair of gray wool gloves. Sadie stared at them for a long time before saying, It isn't that cold yet." "It will be," he answered simply. She didn't thank him, and he didn't wait to be thanked, but she put the gloves on. Her long, slender fingers that an observant person would recognize as not belonging to someone born on the pavement, moved experimentally inside the new wool. "Do they fit?" he asked. "They fit." Then, before she could stop herself, she added, "The man who used to buy gloves for me always bought them too large. He never looked at my hands closely enough." The words slipped out, and she immediately fell silent, as though she had opened a door she hadn't intended to open. Ronan didn't step through it. He simply sat down on the stone step at a careful distance from her, close enough to talk, far enough that she wouldn't feel crowded. They sat that way in silence for a while, watching the mist slowly lift from the street. Then, as always, his eyes drifted toward the notebook on her lap. The pages were filled with musical staffs, crowded with handwritten notes. Some sections had been crossed out so heavily that the paper beneath them was nearly hidden, while others were spotless, as though they had been copied again for the 100th time. "How far have you gotten?" he asked. "I'm still stuck at the same part." She turned a page, her finger lightly touching the empty staff at the bottom. "It's missing something I haven't been able to find in 3 years. Have you ever considered that you might be looking in the wrong place?" Sadie turned to look at him for the first time that morning, and something flashed in her eyes. Something close to defiance and close to pain. "You speak as though you understand music." "I don't understand music." Ronan met her gaze directly. "But I understand what it feels like to carry something unfinished inside you and have no way to bring it to an end." She was silent for a long time after that. Then she closed the notebook and held it against her chest by instinct. "When are you going to let me hear it?" he asked, the question he had asked at least a dozen times over the past 6 months, and she gave him the same answer she always gave: "When it's finished." But that morning, for reasons she couldn't explain, she added another sentence, so softly that it nearly dissolved into the mist. "It may never be finished. Some things, once they're broken, are always missing something, no matter how carefully you put them back together." Ronan didn't answer, because he knew every comforting word would sound cheap in that moment, and this woman had already received enough cheap things from the world. He stood, lightly brushed off his coat, and prepared to leave as he did every day. And as he did every day, before walking back toward the car, he stopped and looked up at a window on the 2nd floor of the church, a narrow pane of glass, hidden behind the branches of an old oak tree, dark and tightly shut. He stared at it for only a few seconds, no longer than that, yet during those few seconds, his entire being seemed to be standing somewhere very far away. Sadie had noticed it long ago. During the 1st month, she thought he was checking the time on the bell tower. During the 2nd, she thought he was watching for someone who might be following him, but by the 6th month, she understood that it wasn't the gaze of a man keeping watch. It was the gaze of a man searching for something. That morning, she decided to ask, "What are you looking at up there?" Ronan remained still for another heartbeat. Then he answered without turning around, his voice as calm as ever, but one note lower. "Something that isn't there anymore. That was all." Then he walked back to the car. The door closed without a sound, and the black vehicle disappeared into the awakening street, leaving Sadie beneath the stone portico with her new gloves, the paper bag still warm beside her, and an answer that wasn't truly an answer lingering in her mind. She looked toward the 2nd floor window, trying to see what might be there, but all she found was dusty glass reflecting the gray sky. She didn't know that 15 years earlier, something behind that window had once saved a person, and that fate, in its strangest and most patient way, I was waiting for the right day to reveal to both of them that they had met long before the first morning when he arrived, carrying a paper bag. 3 days later, Boston was struck by the heaviest rain of the season. It began in the afternoon, and by evening it was pouring as though someone had torn the entire sky open, water streaming down the slopes of the old neighborhood. And when the black car stopped in front of St. Brendan Church at nearly 7 o'clock that evening, Ronan saw exactly what he had been worrying about throughout his final meeting of the day. The church portico was drenched by sheets of wind-blown rain. The stone slab where Sadie usually sat was soaked through. Her old blanket had been hastily wrapped in plastic, and she was pressed against the locked wooden door, both arms holding her music notebook tightly against her chest, shielding it beneath her coat like a mother protecting her child from the rain. He didn't get out of the car immediately. He sat behind the wheel for several seconds, watching the woman trying to make herself smaller in the middle of the storm, and something inside him, the boundary he had guarded so carefully for 6 months, the measured distance between them on the stone steps, their brief conversations, the way he arrived and left at the same time each day like a machine, all of it suddenly seemed meaningless tonight. He stepped out, crossed through the rain, and stopped in front of her. Sadie looked up, rainwater running down her temples, and the first thing she said was spoken in a voice that tried to sound ordinary. "It isn't 6 o'clock in the morning." Ronan removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders before she had time to step back. "Come have dinner with me." She stood motionless, staring at him as though she hadn't heard correctly. "There's a small diner 2 blocks away that's still open," he continued. "They make the best clam chowder in this neighborhood." Sadie let out a dry laugh with no trace of amusement in it. "Look at me." She spread her arms slightly so he could see what she looked like. Her clothes wet, her shoes wet, her entire body worn down and soaked through. "You're inviting a homeless woman to dinner." And Ronan answered without blinking, without even a second of hesitation. "I'm inviting Sadie." Those 4 words left her standing silent beneath the sound of the rain. It had been 3 years since anyone had spoken her name that way, as though she were a human being with a name of her own rather than a condition, rather than a vague miss, rather than "you over there," rather than someone people glanced at before quickly looking away. She lowered her head at once, and he pretended not to notice her, wiping a hand across her eyes. He only added in his usual even voice, "Besides, I hate eating alone. For the past 6 months, you've been the only person I've had breakfast with. By my calculations, you owe me 1 dinner." Somehow, that unreasonable argument was the very thing that made her nod. The little diner was tucked inside an alley and had only 5 wooden tables and an elderly owner who asked nothing except what the 2 of them wanted to eat. They sat at a table in the corner, the heat from the kitchen spreading warmly through the room, and when 2 steaming bowls of clam chowder were set before them, Sadie lifted her spoon with both hands. She ate slowly, her back straight, her elbows never resting on the table, the manners she had learned in another life returning as though they had never left her, and Ronan quietly watched, quietly storing the sight in his memory beside all the other pieces he had gathered over the past 6 months. Halfway through dinner, the phone in his pocket began to vibrate. He didn't answer. It vibrated a second time, then a third, persistent and irritated, much like the person calling. Sadie set down her spoon. "You should answer it." "I don't mind." Ronan took out his phone and looked at the screen, where Tessa's name appeared beside 4 missed calls and a long message written entirely in capital letters, then placed it face down on the table. "It's nothing urgent. Your sister?" she asked, and when he raised an eyebrow, she shrugged. "You looked at the screen the way people look at family, as though you want to turn them off but can't quite bring yourself to do it." Ronan was silent for a moment, then perhaps because of the warmth inside the diner, because of the sound of rain outside, or because the woman sitting across from him was the only person in Boston who wasn't afraid of the Gallagher name, he told her. He told her about the wedding in Cape Cod 1 month from now, about the powerful family his sister was marrying into, and about the ultimatum she had delivered at the dinner table, insisting that he appear with a woman worthy of his position. He could borrow one, hire one, she didn't care, as long as he didn't embarrass her. He spoke in the calm voice of a man who had grown accustomed to swallowing everything inside. But beneath that calm, Sadie heard something she knew by heart, the feeling of standing among family and still being utterly alone. When he finished, she asked very softly, "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." He slowly turned his water glass. "One of my men suggested hiring a model who specializes in pretending to be a girlfriend for powerful families. I refused. Why? Because I've already had enough false things in my life." The answer settled between them, and the little diner suddenly became so quiet that they could hear the rain tapping against the metal roof. Sadie stared down at her empty bowl for a long time. Then, before she had time to think, before the rational part of her that reminded her every day to know her place could speak, she said, "If it would help you, I could go with you." A second later, she heard her own words, and her face went pale even faster than she had spoken them. "I'm sorry." She shook her head repeatedly, her hands twisting tightly together. "I don't know what I was saying. Forget it. Someone like me standing at that wedding would only make things harder for you. I'm truly sorry. The meal must have been so good that it made me forget who I am." She said the final sentence with a self-mocking smile, the smile of someone who had learned to hurt herself before anyone else had the chance. But Ronan didn't laugh. He looked at her for a long time, so long that she had to lower her eyes. And when he finally spoke, his voice was no longer the voice of the man who commanded the entire harbor. It was far more exposed than that. "Do you know the last time someone offered to help me without wanting anything in return?" Sadie shook her head in confusion. "Neither do I," he said. "For the past 10 years, every hand extended toward me has had a price written on the back. Some wanted contracts, some wanted favors, some wanted protection, and some wanted a way to climb higher. You're the first person in 10 years to offer me help without even knowing what you might receive in return." He paused, then continued, speaking each word slowly and clearly, as though signing an agreement. "So I won't forget it, and I accept." Sadie's eyes widened. "Wait, you're serious? I just told you to forget it." Ronan stood, placed money on the table, and put on the coat that was still damp from the rain. For the first time in 6 months, Sadie saw the corner of his mouth rise into something close to a smile. "I'll pick you up at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said. "Pick me up for what?" she called after him, her voice still filled with disbelief. "To go home," he answered, as briefly as every sentence he had ever spoken beneath the church portico. Then he opened the door and stepped into the rain, leaving the woman seated in the little diner with a man's coat around her shoulders, her heart pounding like village drums, and a feeling that had died 3 years earlier suddenly stirring back to life. The feeling that tomorrow, for the first time in a very long while, was a day worth waiting for. At 6 o'clock the following morning, the black car stopped in front of the portico of St. Brendan Church, exactly as promised. But this time Ronan wasn't carrying a paper bag. He opened the front passenger door and stood waiting. Sadie had been sitting there for a long time, everything she owned in the world packed into a faded backpack, her music notebook held against her chest. She stared at the open car door for a long while as though she were looking over the edge of a cliff, then drew a deep breath and climbed inside. Neither of them spoke during the drive. There was only the soft sound of the windshield wipers clearing away what remained of the previous night's rain, and when the tall iron gates of the Gallagher estate opened, when the gravel drive stretched through broad lawns toward the 3-story gray stone mansion slowly emerging from the morning mist, Sadie tightened her grip on the notebook without realizing it. "Do you live here alone?" she asked softly. "With my father, and with people who've been with my family longer than I can remember," he replied. Then the car stopped at the front steps, where 2 people were already waiting. A silver-haired woman dressed neatly in a white apron and a tall man standing as straight as an oak tree. "This is Ruth, the person who keeps this entire house running, and Sam, the man who keeps all of us safe." Ronan introduced them briefly, then turned toward the other 2. "And this is Sadie, my guest." Sadie extended her hand by reflex, then suddenly stopped, conscious of her rough skin and nails cut down to the quick. But Ruth took her hand between both of her warm palms before she could pull it back. "Welcome to the family, Miss Sadie," she said. And those 2 simple words, Miss Sadie, spoken with such pure and untroubled respect, tightened Sadie's throat so completely that she could only nod instead of thanking her. Sam inclined his head in the way one would greet a lady. "Allow me to take your luggage." He lifted the faded backpack with the same care he might have shown an expensive leather suitcase, without a searching glance or a moment of hesitation, and Sadie had to turn away and pretend to admire the garden because she knew that if she looked at that kindness for even 1 second longer, she would begin to cry in front of strangers. Ruth led her through the garden to the guest house, nestled beside a row of pine trees, a small house with white-framed windows. Everything inside had already been prepared: a spotless white bed, a bathroom scented with soap, and several sets of comfortable clothes hanging in the wardrobe with their tags still attached. "This room is yours," Ruth said. "Mine? For how long?" Sadie asked. And Ruth looked at her with the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to understand what every question was truly asking. "Mr. Ronan has already given his instructions. For as long as you need it." She placed the key in Sadie's hand. "This is your key. The door locks from the inside. No one will enter unless you give them permission." That sentence, too. The way Ruth gave her the right to lock a door, the small right she hadn't possessed for 3 years, made Sadie lower herself slowly onto the edge of the bed to keep from falling apart. That night, after the light dinner Ruth brought all the way to her room, Sadie took her first hot bath in many months, changed into new clothes that smelled of clean fabric, and stood staring at the spotless white bed for a long time. Then she did something that left Ruth frozen the following morning when she arrived with breakfast. Sadie had taken a blanket, spread it over the rug beside the bed, and slept there, curled up exactly as she had beneath the church portico, with the music notebook beneath her head. Ruth told Ronan what she had seen in a choked voice when he stopped by to ask after Sadie. And that afternoon, when he went to the guest house, he asked in his usual direct way, "Why didn't you sleep in the bed?" Sadie was sitting beside the window with the notebook on her lap. She remained silent for a moment, then answered with the naked truth, "I'm afraid I'll get used to it." She looked out at the garden, her voice as calm as though she were discussing the weather. "None of this belongs to me. 3 weeks from now, when the wedding is over, I'll give back your coat, give back this room, and return to the church portico. If I've grown used to a warm mattress by then, the stone will feel twice as cold. Do you understand? People like me aren't afraid of hardship. We're only afraid of tasting happiness and then having to spit it back out." Ronan stood there listening. He didn't comfort her or make promises because he knew that, for this woman, every promise had to be proven with something other than words. Before leaving, he only said, "Whether you sleep on the mattress or the rug is your choice, but you keep the key. That's the only thing I ask." Late that evening, he knocked on the door of his father's study. Patrick was reading beside the fireplace when his son delivered the news in a single sentence. "I'm bringing a woman to Tessa's wedding. She's staying in the guest house. Her name is Sadie." The old man closed his book and removed his glasses. Ronan had prepared himself for a barrage of questions. Who was she? Where had he met her? What was her background? What would happen if the Whitmores found out? But Patrick asked only one thing. "Does she make you laugh?" Ronan stood motionless before the question, and he realized that he had answered truthfully before he even had time to think. "She makes me feel quiet." The room fell silent for a moment, with only the sound of burning wood between them. Then Patrick nodded, put his glasses back on, and reopened his book as though the matter were settled. "Then hold on to her." Ronan returned to his office when the clock struck 11. He stood beside the window and looked toward the guest house. The light in its window had already gone dark. The woman was probably curled up on the rug with her notebook beneath her head, and the corners of his mouth softened slightly. Then he sat at his desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, the only drawer in that room that was always kept locked, and removed a thick file. The desk lamp illuminated the bold letters printed across its cover. Sadie Lawson, with a date stamped in the upper right corner, 5 months earlier. Everything was inside. Documents, photographs, densely typed pages, even pictures taken from a distance beneath the portico of St. Brendan Church. He turned through each page with the unhurried fingers of a man who had read them so many times that he knew them by heart, then stopped for a long time at a page near the end, his eyes darkening like deep water. The man had known everything about her before she had even learned his name, long before the rainy evening and the bowl of clam chowder, perhaps even before the first paper bag. He returned the file to the drawer, turned the key, switched off the lamp, and in the darkness of the room, only one unanswered question remained suspended in the air. Those 6 months of paper bags delivered at 6 o'clock every morning, had they truly been the kindness of a man, or the calculated move of a crime lord? At that same time, a little more than an hour's drive south of Boston, Tessa stood in the grand lobby of the Cape Cod resort, with her phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, one hand turning through a thick stack of seating chart sketches that looked more like a military operations plan. "No, I've already told you, the senator's table must face directly toward the ocean, and absolutely no reporters are to be seated within 3 tables of my family." She ended the call and released a long breath, and Caleb, who was sitting on the wooden steps watching his fiancée, finally asked the question he had been holding back all morning. "Do you realize that since we arrived, you haven't looked at the ocean even once?" Tessa turned around. "The ocean will always be there. A wedding only happens once." "Exactly." Caleb rose and walked toward her. "It only happens once, which is why I want you to enjoy it, not manage it like a political campaign." Tessa laughed, but the sound was as thin as paper. "That's easy for you to say because you were born on the side that never has to prove anything. You're a Whitmore. Whenever you enter a room, people stand and shake your hand. But for the past 2 years, every time I've walked into your family's living room, I've heard that half-second of silence before everyone smiles. That half-second when every one of them is thinking, 'Oh, the Gallagher girl.'" Caleb looked at her, his voice softening. "My mother cares about you. My father does too. After 2 years, yes. After 2 years of memorizing the name of every judge and every donor, learning how to talk about wine and vacations in Nantucket, even learning how to laugh without sounding like the daughter of a crime lord. She sat down in a wicker chair, her fingers unconsciously turning her engagement ring. This wedding isn't only a wedding, Caleb. It's my graduation examination, the one day when that entire world can acknowledge that I belong there. All it takes is one thing going off script, one unsuitable guest, one whisper, and 2 years of my life will be swept into the ocean. Caleb remained silent for a long time, then asked the question they would both remember later. Answer me honestly. Are you marrying me, or are you marrying the approval of that world? Tessa froze, and genuine hurt flickered in her eyes. Is that what you think of me? I don't think anything. I'm asking. I love you, she said, and it was the truth. But you were born standing in the light, so you don't understand. For people like me, who have to climb out of the darkness, being accepted and being loved sometimes becomes so tangled together that they can't be separated. The answer was so honest that Caleb couldn't bring himself to press her any further. He simply pulled her against his shoulder, and Tessa allowed herself to rest there for exactly 3 seconds before the phone rang again. This time, it was about the budget. She answered, frowned, then said, "Go ahead and transfer the orchestra deposit to Prez at Caleb's father's office. He's handling all the wedding accounts. Every payment and expense goes through him, so everything stays in one place." She ended the call and turned to Caleb. Thank goodness for Prez. If he hadn't been managing the finances these past 2 months, I think I would have lost my mind. Your father really knows how to hire capable people. Caleb nodded absently. Yes, he's only been working at my father's office for a little over a year, but he handles everything perfectly. My father trusts him completely. Then they both dismissed the name as lightly as they might brush away a speck of dust, neither of them knowing they had just mentioned the knife lying silently inside their own family's drawer. That afternoon, when Caleb went down to the beach to meet with the resort manager, Tessa remained alone in the lobby. Her phone lit up with a message from her closest friend in Boston, carrying the delighted tone of someone eager to spread gossip. Hey, is your family hiding some happy news from me? My husband heard from people in the florist and interior furnishing circles that the Gallagher mansion has been ordering fresh flowers for the guest house every day this week, and stylists have been coming and going. Apparently, your brother has brought a woman there to live. So when are we getting invited to the wedding feast? Tessa read the message 3 times. Her fingers typed a reply, erased it, typed again, then erased it once more. A woman was living in the mansion's guest house, and she, his own sister, knew nothing about it. She called her brother. The phone rang 5 times before going to voicemail. She called Ruth, and the housekeeper answered in a voice of perfect composure. Yes, Mr. Ronan has a guest. You should ask him directly about his personal affairs, Miss Tessa. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to say anything. That careful secrecy only made the heat inside Tessa rise higher. She stood and paced the length of the lobby. Logic told her this was good news. Her brother finally had a woman in his life, exactly what she had demanded in her ultimatum. She should have been celebrating, but an instinct kept clawing at the inside of her chest and refused to settle. Ronan had never brought a woman to the mansion. Never. Not once in 34 years. Yet only 3 weeks before her wedding, an unknown woman had suddenly appeared. A woman with no name anyone recognized, no known background, no face familiar to anyone in their world, now living in the family guest house. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why now? When Caleb returned, he found his fiancée standing beside the glass doors, looking north toward Boston, and he recognized that posture. Her back straight, her chin raised, her thumb rubbing repeatedly over her ring, the way Tessa always stood when she sensed a threat. Is something wrong? He asked. Tessa turned and gave him the smile she had spent 2 years perfecting, the kind that allowed no one to see what lay behind it. Nothing, she said. I've just realized there's one more thing I haven't checked. That evening, after dinner, Ronan didn't return to his office as usual. He waited for Sadie by the garden entrance with a storm lantern in his hand and said simply, "I want to show you somewhere." They walked through the dark garden, past the row of pine trees, to the farthest corner of the estate, where an old greenhouse stood silent beneath the moon. Its white painted iron frame had peeled in several places. Its glass panes were clouded with moisture, and a brass padlock stained green by time hung from the door. Ronan took a small key from his pocket and Sadie noticed that his hand paused for a moment before the lock. A strange hesitation in a man who had never hesitated before any door. The lock clicked, the door opened, and the scent of damp earth and green leaves rushed out like the breath of a forgotten world. Inside, beneath the lantern light, climbing roses covered the trellises, while white daisies and lavender filled the beds. Everything was still alive, still watered and carefully trimmed, but arranged according to some old order that no one had ever dared to change. "This place belonged to my mother," Ronan said, setting the lantern on the wooden table in the center of the greenhouse. "She died 15 years ago. Ruth has cared for the flowers ever since, but no one has been allowed through that door, not even my father." Sadie stood among the flower beds, afraid to touch anything. "Then why did you bring me here?" she asked. Ronan was silent for a moment, then answered in the voice of a man removing a layer of armor from himself. "For 6 months, you've sat beneath the church portico and told me your story through your silence. Tonight, I want to hear it in words, and I think it should happen in a place where I also have to pay a price for entering. That seems fair." She looked at him for a long time beneath the warm lantern light, then sat in the wooden chair beside the table, still holding the music notebook against herself out of habit, and began to speak slowly, like someone opening a room that had been sealed for 3 years. "I used to play piano at Symphony Hall." She said it as lightly as though she were saying she had once lived on the next street, but Ronan saw her fingers tighten around the notebook's cover. "When I was 22, I gave my first solo recital. The newspapers called me the name worth hearing most that season. My grandmother sat in the front row, and she cried from the first piece to the last. My parents died in an accident when I was 6. She raised me with a small laundromat, with nights spent staying late to mend clothes for customers, and with an old piano she bought on an installment plan that took 4 years to pay off." She stopped, her eyes resting on the white daisies. "Then he appeared." Sadie spoke those 2 words, "he appeared," in a strangely flat voice, the way someone might speak of an old illness rather than a person. "He managed several artists. He was capable, charming, and knew exactly what people wanted to hear. He told me my talent deserved larger stages, that all I had to do was play, and he would take care of everything else. 2 years later, we were engaged, and I handed him everything. My contracts, my accounts, my signature, even papers I signed without reading, because I was too busy rehearsing to keep up with my performance schedule. I thought there was no reason to read them when I trusted the man I was going to marry." Ronan said nothing. He only sat in the chair across from her, and inside the greenhouse, the only sound was the night insects beyond the misted glass. "One morning, I woke up, and my entire world collapsed during a single phone call," Sadie continued. "The accounts were empty. The deposits for an entire concert season had disappeared. The papers I had signed turned out to be loan agreements, mortgages, and powers of attorney. My name was on every one of them, and he had vanished from Boston without a trace. No one came looking for him. They came looking for me because, on paper, I was the one in debt, the one who looked suspicious. The theater canceled my contract. My colleagues avoided me. The people who had once crowded my dressing room with flowers suddenly became too busy to answer." The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "I sold my apartment to repay part of the debt. Then my grandmother became ill, and I sold the last thing I had, the piano she had spent 4 years paying for, to cover the hospital bills." She lowered her eyes to her hands. "She died on a winter morning, holding my hand and telling me, 'Don't let them take your music from you. Everything else can be lost, but not that.' 3 months later, I left my final rented room with 1 backpack, and the portico of St. Brendan Church became my address." The story ended there, without tears, and that dryness made it heavier than any crying could have been. Ronan asked quietly, "During those 3 years, what was the hardest part?" Sadie looked up at him, and her answer came slowly, 1 word at a time, as though it had been sharpened in her mind through 1,000 cold nights. "Do you know what kills a person fastest? It isn't hunger. You can find a way to survive hunger. It's having an entire city walk past you every day as though you were a lamppost. People step around you so they won't have to touch you. They talk on their phones while passing directly in front of your face, and their eyes slide over you the same way they slide over the pavement. After a few months, you begin to believe what their eyes are telling you, that you're no longer a person, only an obstacle in the road." She held the notebook tighter against her chest. "Then the paper bag every morning?" Ronan asked, his voice dropping lower. Sadie looked at him, and for the first time that evening, her eyes shimmered with tears beneath the lantern light. "It wasn't the food," she said. "It was knowing that someone still noticed I existed. Every morning at 6 o'clock, for 6 months, someone stopped in the same place, looked directly into my eyes, remembered that I didn't want onions in my soup, remembered what size gloves fit my hands. You don't understand. On the worst days, I lived from 6 o'clock in the morning to the next, only to make sure I hadn't turned into a lamppost." Silence settled over the greenhouse, so deep that the fall of a single rose petal could be heard. Ronan sat there, the man who could bring the entire harbor to a standstill with one phone call, and couldn't find a single word to say because a truth was lodged across his chest, the truth locked inside a drawer in his office, the truth that he had known everything she had just told him before she ever spoke it, even the things she hadn't told him, and that the first paper bag 6 months earlier had never been an accident. He looked at the woman sitting among his mother's flowers, holding the music notebook as though it were the final piece of her life that hadn't been taken away. And for the first time in his life, Ronan Gallagher, a man who had never owed anyone anything without repaying it in full, realized that some debts only grew heavier the more one tried to repay them. They remained in the greenhouse for a long while, and then, as though her honesty demanded honesty in return, Ronan began to speak, slowly and with difficulty, because these were words he had never spoken to anyone. "My mother died when I was 19. Cancer. They discovered it too late. From the day we found out until the day she was gone, there were only 4 months." He looked at the climbing roses covering the iron frame. "At the time, my father was at the height of his power, and also at the height of the hatred directed toward him. There were more undercover police officers at my mother's funeral than there were relatives. 1 week after the funeral, my father called me into his study, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said, 'From this day forward, you're the heir. There's no place for tears in the Gallagher family. Finish crying tonight, then get up tomorrow morning like a man.'" Ronan slowly turned the storm lantern on the table. "I did exactly that. I stood up the next morning, and for 15 years, I haven't allowed myself to sit down again. I learned how to make the entire city fear me before I turned 25. I learned how to sign decisions that left other people with nothing without letting my hand tremble. I learned how to eat dinner alone in a house with 30 rooms. People call that strength." The corner of his mouth lifted faintly. "I call it slowly becoming accustomed to freezing solid. You asked why I understood what it felt like to have something unfinished inside you that could never be brought to an end. That's why. I was never allowed to finish mourning my mother. 15 years later, that funeral still hasn't ended in here." He lightly touched a finger to the left side of his chest, such a small gesture that anyone who wasn't watching carefully might have thought he was merely adjusting his shirt. Sadie looked at the man before her, and for the first time, she saw what all of Boston had failed to see, that beneath the ice surrounding the head of the family was a 19-year-old boy, still standing in the same place. A boy no one had ever given permission to grieve. Neither of them said anything more, but an invisible thread had been tied between the 2 wooden chairs in the greenhouse that night, the thread connecting 2 people who each carried a sealed room inside their chest. Then Ronan rose, picked up the storm lantern, and said something that surprised even him. "Come with me. There's one more place." He led her back toward the mansion, through the long hallway, and stopped before a room at the far end of the first floor that Sadie had assumed was a storage room because its door was always closed. He opened it and turned on the light. A chandelier illuminated a small sitting room furnished in an old-fashioned style, and in the center, beneath a white cloth that had yellowed to ivory, stood a large shape, whose outline alone made Sadie's heart miss a beat. Ronan walked toward it, took hold of the edge of the cloth, paused for a second the way someone pauses before touching a wound, then pulled it away. Dust rose into the chandelier light, like a small glittering cloud, revealing a black grand piano beneath it, its lid closed, its polished wood covered by a thin layer of dust like mist. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She wasn't very good. She always missed the rhythm, but she played every night. She said a house belonging to a family like ours needed some kind of sound other than ringing telephones and closing doors. No one has touched it since she died. Ruth dusts it once a year on the anniversary of her death, then covers it again. It's remained silent for 15 years. He turned toward Sadie and spoke so quietly that his words nearly dissolved into the air. "I want to hear it come alive again, if you're willing." Sadie stood frozen. She looked at the piano, then at him. "I haven't touched a key in 3 years. My hands are covered in calluses now. I'll ruin this moment." Ronan only shook his head. "No one is judging you here. There's only a room that has been silent for too long." She walked toward the piano one step at a time, moving as slowly as though she were crossing thin ice. She placed her music notebook on the stand, opened the lid, and the black and white keys appeared untouched beneath the dust of time. She pulled out the bench, sat down, and placed both hands on the keys. Ronan could clearly see that all 10 fingers were trembling like the wings of a bird that had been caged for too long and was now standing before an open door. One note sounded, lonely and uncertain, then a second. Then her left hand found its place. Her right hand found the road home. And beneath the calloused fingers of a homeless woman, the melody inside the notebook, the piece that had remained unfinished for 3 years, finally entered the world for the first time. It began with single notes, separate yet clear as drops of water falling onto a still lake, then slowly grew, winding around itself, gentle and heartbreakingly sad, the melody of someone who had lost everything, but was still desperately trying to remember that the world had once been beautiful. Ruth heard the piano from the kitchen. She dropped the towel in her hand, hurried into the hallway, and stopped motionless in the doorway, both hands covering her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. But Ronan's reaction was the strangest of all. He had been standing with one hand resting against the back of a chair, and when the melody reached its middle passage, when it rose in that sweeping phrase before falling again like a sigh, his entire body went rigid. His face, the face that had never changed before anything, became visibly pale beneath the chandelier light. He gripped the back of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and just as Sadie was losing herself in the most passionate measures, she heard hurried footsteps striking the wooden floor behind her, followed by the sound of a door. She pulled her hands away from the keys and turned around. The room was empty. Only Ruth remained frozen in the doorway, while the final chord slowly faded from the air. Ronan was gone. Without a word, he had fled the room as though he were escaping, the most powerful man in Boston running from a piece of music. Sadie sat motionless on the piano bench, her hands still suspended above the keys, and the old familiar feeling returned, sending a cold wave down her spine, the feeling of someone who had just destroyed something sacred that had never belonged to her. She had touched a piano no one had been permitted to touch for 15 years. What had she done wrong? What pain had she awakened inside this house? She looked toward Ruth for help, her voice breaking. "What did I just do? I hurt him, didn't I?" But Ruth didn't answer her question. The elderly housekeeper was staring at her with a strange expression Sadie had never seen before. It wasn't blame or anger. It was shock mingled with something very close to recognition, as though, after 15 years, she had just watched a ghost walk through the door, and in the heavy silence of that room, only one question remained suspended between 3 people and a piano that had just awakened. Why had the unfinished piece in the homeless woman's notebook, the melody she had written with her entire life, made Ronan Gallagher run away as though he had just heard someone calling to him from a night 15 years earlier? Ruth helped Sadie into the armchair beside the piano, poured her a cup of tea even though her own hands were trembling just as badly, then pulled over a chair and sat across from her. She remained silent for a very long time, as though she needed to rearrange 15 years inside her mind before she could begin. "You didn't do anything wrong, Miss Sadie," she said. "Quite the opposite. But for you to understand what just happened, I have to tell you about a night no one in this house has ever been allowed to mention." She placed both hands in her lap, her eyes resting on the piano, whose lid was still open. 15 years ago, the lady of the house spent her final days at St. Brendan Hospital, the old hospital beside the church. It has since been relocated. But back then the critical care ward was in the wing facing the church courtyard, separated from it by only a narrow alley. I stayed there with the family through all 4 months. On the final night, the doctors asked everyone to leave the room so they could do what they needed to do. The master had to go down to the lobby because the police and the press had caught wind of the situation, so the only person left in the second-floor hallway was young Mr. Ronan, 19 years old, sitting alone on a row of freezing metal chairs. Ruth paused, and her voice dropped lower. I was standing only a few steps away, and I had never seen anyone fall apart the way he did. He didn't cry aloud. No one in this family ever dared to cry aloud. He only folded over, both hands gripping his hair, trembling in waves like someone burning with fever. and I heard him whisper the same sentence over and over again. I can't stand anymore, Mother. I can't stand anymore. 19 years old. Do you understand? That boy knew that in only a little while, the door would open and he would lose his mother, and by the following morning, the terrible weight of this family would be placed on his shoulders. No one asked whether he was strong enough to carry it. The tea in Sadie's hands had gone cold, though she hadn't noticed. And then, Ruth continued, at that very moment, through the hallway window that had been left slightly open, music drifted across the alley from a second-floor window of the church. I later learned that the church used to offer an evening charity music class for poor children in the neighborhood, and those with talent were allowed to stay late and practice. Someone was working on a piece that night, probably something of their own, because I kept hearing the same passage repeated again and again, clear single notes like drops of water, followed by a rising phrase that fell away like a sigh. She looked directly at Sadie. It was the exact passage you played tonight, Miss Sadie. 15 years have passed, and I recognized it by the third measure, so don't ask why the young master turned pale. Sadie sat perfectly still as a chill moved down her spine. 15 years earlier, she had been 12 years old, an orphan whose grandmother had enrolled her in the charity music class at St. Brendan Church, a little girl who often begged her teacher to let her stay late and practice beside the second-floor window because there was no piano at home, and the melody she had searched for and played again and again, night after night, had been the first notes of the piece she would later write into the leather-bound notebook and carry with her throughout her life as though she were carrying her grandmother and her childhood. Ruth continued, her voice gradually tightening with emotion. That music drifted into the hallway, and I watched the strangest thing I have ever seen. Mr. Ronan slowly raised his head, sat upright, closed his eyes, and simply listened. Tears ran down his face, but his body stopped shaking. The uncertain practice of some child across the alley held him that night in a way none of us adults could. When the hospital room door opened, he stood, walked inside, and held his mother's hand until the final moment, steady as a man. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. After the funeral, he returned to the church and asked about the music class. But you know how charity classes are. Children come and go. There were no proper records, and the elderly priest only vaguely remembered a few neighborhood children who sometimes stayed late. Ronan couldn't find the child, and he couldn't publicly search either. The heir to the Gallagher family couldn't allow anyone to know that he had once collapsed in a hospital hallway. For years afterward, I would sometimes see his car parked outside St. Brendan Church. He would only sit there, look up at the second-floor window for a while, then leave. I thought that with time, he had forgotten. Then, around 3 years ago, he came home one evening wearing an expression I had only seen once before, when the lady of the house was still alive, and called him her precious little boy in front of guests, leaving him embarrassed and happy at the same time. He didn't tell me anything, but not long afterward, Sam let something slip. That evening, while passing the church, the young master had ordered the car to stop because he heard a woman sitting beneath the portico, softly humming a melody. Ruth looked at Sadie, and she didn't need to finish the sentence. From that day on, there were mornings when he left the house at 5:30. He went in the rain. He went through storms. Whoever wanted to meet with him had to wait until after 7 o'clock. I've been the housekeeper here for 30 years, Miss Sadie. Every evening I prepared that paper bag, believing I was packing food, when in truth, I was wrapping a thank you he had owed for 15 years without knowing where to send it. Sadie sprang to her feet. She didn't remember how she crossed the garden. She only knew that when she came back to herself, she was standing at the greenhouse door, where the storm lantern was still burning, and Ronan sat on the wooden chair among his mother's flowers, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed, looking exactly like the 19-year-old boy who had once sat on the metal chairs in that hospital hallway. He heard her footsteps, but didn't look up. Sadie stood in the doorway, still breathing hard, and asked the only question left after everything she had heard. "Why didn't you tell me?" The greenhouse was so quiet that the flame inside the storm lantern could be heard. Then Ronan raised his head and looked at her. For the first time in 15 years, the man's eyes were red, and he answered in a rough, broken voice, "Because if I told you, you would think you owed me." He paused, as though gathering all 15 years into the sentence that followed. "But I'm the one who owes you." That night, neither of them said anything grand. Sadie simply stepped into the greenhouse, sat down in the wooden chair across from him, and they remained among the flower beds until the storm lantern ran out of oil. two people indebted to each other in different ways. Yet in the end, neither asked anything of the other. They only understood in silence that from now on, no paper bag would ever need to be set down without words again. And the days that followed, that brief stretch of time before the wedding, passed like a gentle passage of music that both of them knew was rare in lives such as theirs. During the final week, the stylist Miles had arranged brought the evening gown for the Cape Cod wedding to the guest house, and on the evening Sadie tried it on, Ruth lingered in the hallway for a long time before finally gathering the courage to knock on the office door. "Sir, you should come and see." Ronan went, and he stopped at the threshold of the guest house longer than he expected. Sadie stood in the middle of the room wearing a gown, the deep blue of the midnight sea. Her hair swept neatly back to reveal her slender shoulders, and the woman who had spent 6 months curled beneath the church portico now stood there, looking so unfamiliar to herself that she didn't know where to place her hands. She kept smoothing the fabric as though afraid it might disappear. She looked at him through the mirror and smiled awkwardly. "Don't look at me like that. It's only because the dress is beautiful and the makeup artist is talented. They worked on me all afternoon." Ronan walked up behind her, looked at her reflection in the mirror, and spoke in that even voice of a man who had never known how to compliment anyone. "They only did the easy part. You brought the most beautiful part with you." Sadie lowered her eyes, and in the mirror, he saw the tips of her ears turn red. She didn't argue with him as she usually did. She only said softly, "This is the first time in 3 years I've dared to stand in front of a mirror for longer than a minute." "Then stay a little longer," he replied. "The mirrors in this house don't charge by the hour." That rare and clumsy attempt at humor made her laugh aloud, a clear and weightless sound, and Ruth, standing outside the door, had to pretend to be busy rearranging a stack of towels to hide her own smile. A few days later, one afternoon when Sadie went into the garden to gather lavender for Ruth to place in the kitchen, she came upon Patrick sitting alone on a stone bench beneath the old oak tree. She stopped and nearly turned away because she had avoided him ever since arriving. Even in retirement, the man carried an authority that made her feel as though she had no right to occupy the same scene, but he had already seen her, and he lightly patted the seat beside him. "Sit down, child." Sadie sat on the very edge of the bench, her back straight, both hands resting on her knees like a schoolgirl before the principal, and prepared herself for the questions she feared most. "Who are you? What happened in your past? What do you intend to do with my son?" But Patrick asked nothing. He sat in silence for a long time, watching the afternoon sunlight pass through the oak leaves, then spoke in a slow, deep voice. "My wife used to sit in this exact place every afternoon. She said this was where she could hear the piano drifting from the house most clearly." He turned the worn wedding ring around his aging finger. "I haven't sat on this bench since she died. For 15 years, I walked around it every day. Lately, I've started sitting here again." He turned to look at Sadie, and in the eyes that had once made the entire Boston underworld bow its head, there remained only the eyes of an aging husband who missed his wife. "It has been 15 years since I last heard a piano in this house." "Thank you, child." That was all. Then he rose, leaned on his cane, and walked back toward the mansion, leaving Sadie in the garden with a bundle of lavender in her hands and a thank you heavier than any interrogation, something that kept her sitting there in silence for a long time, because a person could guard against suspicion, but no one could defend against kindness. From that day on, the sound of the piano became the new heartbeat of the Gallagher mansion. After dinner each evening, Sadie sat at the piano that had belonged to Ronan's late mother. Sometimes she practiced old pieces to soften her fingers again. Sometimes she searched for a few more measures for the unfinished composition in her notebook. And the gray stone mansion with 30 rooms, a house that had known only ringing telephones and closing doors, slowly began to come alive again. Ruth hummed quietly while cooking. Sam lingered in the hallway for a few extra minutes when changing shifts. Patrick left the door to his study slightly open every night. Ronan alone had a permanent seat, an armchair positioned at an angle from the piano, far enough away not to distract her, yet close enough to watch her hands return to life upon the keys day after day. And during those evenings, the most powerful man in Boston simply sat in silence, without a phone, without documents, listening to the music the way a man might warm himself in sunlight after a winter that had lasted too long. One evening, halfway through the piece, Sadie suddenly stopped and turned toward him. "You know, the ending is still missing, but over the past few days, I've started to hear it faintly somewhere." Ronan asked, "Where is it?" She looked around the room, at the piano, at the man sitting in the armchair, then smiled and shook her head. I can't say yet. I only know that the longer I stay here, the closer it comes. Neither of them gave a name to what was growing between them through evenings such as those. It wasn't time yet, but Ruth, with the eyes of a woman who had lived for 60 years, said something privately to Sam in the kitchen that she would later repeat on the happiest day that house had ever known. The young master spent 15 years searching for a piece of music. Now you see, some debts are meant by heaven to be repaid with the whole heart. And while the mansion grew warmer with every passing evening, no one knew that a little more than an hour's drive to the south, a net was being woven in the darkness by a hand whose cruelty had not yet been understood by either the person setting the trap or the people destined to be caught within it. The net began with a phone call Tessa made one morning while standing in a secluded corner of the Cape Cod garden, where she was certain Caleb couldn't hear her. She had spent 3 days considering it. Calling someone from the family network would be the fastest way. All she had to say was, "Find out everything you can about the woman staying in the guest house." And within 24 hours, she would have every detail. But she also knew exactly how that network operated. Every request flowed back to one place. And in less than a day, Ronan would know that his sister was digging behind his back. No, this had to take another route, one her brother didn't control. She searched through her contacts and stopped at the name of a private investigation firm in Boston that her future mother-in-law had once mentioned over tea, a discreet agency that specialized in serving political families. The Whitmores had trusted them for 20 years to screen employees and even future fiancés, and Tessa knew perfectly well that 2 years earlier, she herself had once existed inside one of their files. The person on the other end answered in a carefully trained, courteous voice, and Tessa spoke briefly. "I need information about a woman, close to 30 years old, currently living at the Gallagher estate. I need to know who she is, where she came from, and most importantly, what she has to hide." She paused, then added, "Under no circumstances can the Gallagher side know that anyone has been asking. Send the bill to my wedding office and list it as a consulting expense." After ending the call, she remained there for a while, looking out at the ocean, telling herself she was only being careful, that if the woman was innocent, no one would lose anything, and like everyone standing on the edge of a terrible mistake. She believed her own reasoning. 4 days later, the file was delivered into her hands, and the moment she picked it up, something in the back of Tessa's mind stirred uneasily. It was too thick, and it had come too quickly. She had once heard her future mother-in-law say that the firm had taken 3 weeks to screen a candidate for a secretarial position, yet the profile of an unknown woman with no permanent address had been completed in 4 days, thick with documents and detailed year by year. The first page contained what she had already half suspected. Sadie Lawson, 27 years old, once a pianist of modest renown, bankrupt, burdened with debt, homeless for the past 3 years, with her most recent address listed as the portico of St. Brendan Church. Tessa's heart dropped with a genuine jolt. A homeless woman. Her brother had brought a homeless woman into the family guest house and was preparing to bring her to Tessa's wedding in front of Boston's entire political world. But it was the pages that followed that turned her hands cold. There was a stack of photocopied financial records, bank statements, transfer documents, and internal reports from a dissolved artist management company, all of them forming a story so perfectly coherent that it seemed beyond dispute. They claimed that the pianist, Sadie Lawson, had taken advance payments for an entire concert tour from investors, then siphoned the money through accounts held in her own name, that the matter had been settled quietly to protect the reputation of the artistic community, and that she had disappeared from the performance world not because she had gone bankrupt, but because no one was willing to work with her anymore. The investigator's conclusion was written neatly on the final page. The subject had a history of financial deception, presented a high level of risk, and caution was strongly advised. Tessa sat for a very long time with the file resting on her lap. And on another day, as another version of herself, she might have asked the most important question of all. Why could evidence condemning a human being be so complete and so readily available, as though someone had prepared it long ago and merely waited for someone to ask? But the bride, now little more than a week from her wedding, asked no such question, because the file said exactly what the fear inside her wanted to hear. At the other end of the net, inside an elegant office high above downtown Boston, where the brass plaque outside the door identified its occupant as a financial advisor to Mr. Whitmore's office, Everything had already begun 3 days earlier in a way none of the people involved in the wedding could possibly have imagined. The investigator, accustomed to working for powerful families, had simply sent a routine professional request to the most trusted keeper of financial data within the Whitmore network. One name, Sadie Lawson, accompanied by a dry question. Did he have access to any old financial records connected to this woman? The client needed them urgently. No reason was given, no context, and not a single mention of the Gallaghers. And the man who received that request, the man who had changed his name and identity into something clean, but was still called Prez by a few familiar people, sat perfectly still before his computer screen for exactly 1 minute. Sadie Lawson. He had believed that name was dead, buried at the bottom of Boston along with the debt documents he had left in her name. Yet now someone was asking about her financial past. Surely one of the old creditors was trying to dig up the matter and squeeze the last little bit of money from a ruined woman. He looked around his beautiful office, at the new life he had built over the past year inside the heart of a political family, and the decision came to him as quickly and cleanly as every decision that had ever destroyed someone else's life. This wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity to bury that name one layer deeper, so deeply that if she ever opened her mouth and told the truth about him, the official documents in black and white would crush her words before anyone had time to believe them. So he opened the old archive, the genuine records belonging to the dissolved management company, and with the practiced hands of a man who had once forged an entire career, he reversed the flow of money on paper, changed the names of the recipients, reconstructed the records so that every dollar he had stolen appeared to have gone into Sadie Lawson's accounts, then sent the materials with a courteous message. These documents are sensitive. Please use them discreetly. He had no idea that the woman he had just stabbed once again was playing the piano every evening inside the mansion of the most powerful man in Boston. But there was one thing he, the investigator, and Tessa all failed to understand. Any net cast too close to the Gallagher family would disturb threads invisible to the naked eye. On the evening of the 5th day, Miles knocked and entered Ronan's office wearing an expression entirely unlike his usual one. There was no joke, no unnecessary explanation. Someone is asking about her. He placed a single printed page on the desk, containing only a few lines. 3 different sources reported activity within the past 2 days. One person searched old court archives. Another asked questions around St. Brendan Church. Professional and discreet, but not discreet enough for our people. Ronan read the paper. His expression didn't change, but his eyes gradually darkened like water before a storm. Find out who hired them, he said briefly. Miles nodded. I'm tracing it. The intermediary is a private investigation firm, the kind that works for wealthy professionals. Give me a few more days. Ronan rose and walked toward the window, looking across at the warm lights of the guest house, where the faint sound of evening piano music drifted through the darkness, and he gave his order in a voice Miles hadn't heard in 12 years, a voice that made him understand the nature of the game had changed. Trace it all the way to the source. Every name in the chain. And don't let her know, not even through a passing breath. That night, the light in Ronan's office remained on until nearly dawn, and in 3 different places, 3 people each held a piece of the same truth, without anyone possessing enough to assemble it. The bride held a false file and believed she was protecting her wedding. The con man sat in his beautiful office believing he had buried the past once and for all, and the crime lord stood beside his window believing he was about to seize a hand moving through the darkness. None of them knew they would all collide at the same dining table during the dinner before the wedding, where the bomb was already counting down its final beats. The dinner before the wedding was served in a private dining room at the Cape Cod Resort, where the 2 families gathered for the final time before the ceremony. Only the adults sat around the long table covered in white linen. The Whitmores occupied one side, with the senator and his wife and several close relatives, while the Gallaghers sat across from them, Patrick, Ronan, and Sadie, in her deep blue gown. She had trembled throughout the entire drive, yet strangely enough, after only half an hour, she was the one who brought warmth to the table. Mrs. Whitmore asked what she thought of Boston, and instead of offering the polished pleasantries people memorized for occasions like this, Sadie spoke about foggy mornings in the old neighborhood and the bells of St. Brendan Church ringing at 6 o'clock. She spoke with the understanding of someone who had truly lived among every brick of that city, not someone who had only observed it through a car window. And the senator's wife, a distinguished woman who had grown weary of young ladies who could speak of nothing but handbags and vacations, listened so intently that she forgot her appetizer. Mr. Whitmore asked what she did for a living. Sadie hesitated for 1 second, and Ronan was just about to speak when she answered first, calmly. I used to pursue music. Then life took another direction. Now I'm trying to find my way back to it. The answer was so honest that no one had the heart to question her further. And Patrick, from the head of the table, gave her a slight nod that only the two of them understood. Even Tessa remained silent. The bride sat watching the woman from the file win over her future family, one person at a time, while the folder waiting upstairs burned in her mind like a live coal. She had planned to speak privately with her brother after dinner, quietly and discreetly. She swore to herself that had been her intention. Then the dining room door opened. My apologies, everyone. I'm late. The drive from Boston was terrible. The man who entered was in his 40s, dressed in a tailored gray suit, wearing the measured smile of someone who made his living by persuading others to trust him. Mr. Whitmore rose cheerfully. Ah, there you are. Everyone, this is the financial advisor to my office, and the savior who has kept the accounts for this wedding. Without him, I'm certain the entire operation would have collapsed. Sit down, Prez. And as he bowed around the table with that professional smile, his gaze swept toward the chair on Ronan's left and stopped. Time at that end of the table seemed to be strangled. Sadie was holding her water glass, and her hand froze in the air. The pulse at her temple pounded so violently that her ears began to ring. For 3 years, she had imagined every possible place where she might see that man again. Outside a courthouse, inside a police station, even beneath the church portico. But not once during all those sleepless nights, had she imagined him emerging from the side of the family her hosts were marrying into, clean and fragrant, being patted on the shoulder and praised as a savior. And he, the man who hadn't allowed his mask to slip once during more than a year of pretending to be respectable, turned visibly pale. The shock was too real for him to conceal. His fingers tightened white around the handle of his leather briefcase, because the name he had pushed one layer deeper into the mud only a week earlier was now sitting before him in flesh and blood, wearing an evening gown, occupying an impossible place beside Ronan Gallagher, while the wine poured to welcome him trembled in his unsteady hand. 2 seconds passed, perhaps 3. And then he pulled himself back into his performance, completed his greetings, and took the empty chair diagonally across the table. But it was already too late for one person in the room. Tessa had witnessed the entire moment. She didn't understand it, but she had seen it, and instead of stopping to question what it meant, the bride's fevered mind interpreted it in the worst possible way. Even a stranger went pale at the sight of her. That was enough. She couldn't wait until after dinner. She couldn't allow this woman to remain among her future family for another minute. Tessa rose, went upstairs, and when she returned, she placed the file on the table before her brother's plate, with enough force to make the wine-glasses tremble. I apologize to everyone, but there's something that must be made clear before tomorrow. Her voice was drawn as tight as a string about to snap. The woman my brother brought here has spent the past 3 years living beneath a church portico, and this file contains financial records, showing that she was once accused of embezzling investors' money. The entire table froze. Mrs. Whitmore set down her fork very softly. Patrick closed his eyes for 1 second like a man who had been stabbed, and within that suffocating silence, a voice spoke, deep and regretful, carrying exactly the right measure of reluctance for an unwilling witness. I had no intention of saying anything, but since matters have reached this point, I'm afraid I must confirm it. I worked in the field of artistic investment during those years. The matter involving Miss Lawson never became a public scandal, but everyone within the industry knew about it. It was deeply unfortunate. Such talent. Preston spoke while his gaze passed over Sadie, with compassion calculated down to the smallest degree. A thief standing in a courtroom of his own creation, and appointing himself as a witness. Each word he released another shovelful of dirt upon the grave he had dug for her 3 years earlier. Sadie remained seated in silence. She looked at the file, then at the man now mourning the ruin of her life in the same voice that had once sworn he loved her. And something strange happened. She didn't shatter. Perhaps a person could only break so many times before everything left inside turned to stone. She folded her napkin, placed it on the table, and rose, her back as straight as it had been during the days when she sat before the piano at Symphony Hall. Then she spoke to Mrs. Whitmore, in a voice that had only grown slightly rough. "Thank you for dinner. Please excuse me. Tomorrow is an important day, and everyone should devote it to happiness." Then she turned toward Tessa, without resentment and without tears. and offered only one sentence: "Congratulations on your wedding." She walked out through the door, every step even and controlled. No one saw the way her hands were clasped behind her back, so tightly that her nails broke the skin. Only after the door closed did every gaze turn toward the man who hadn't spoken a single word from the beginning. Ronan didn't leap to his feet. He didn't strike the table or roar as everyone in the room had held their breath expecting him to do. He remained seated and slowly turned through the file with one finger, glancing across several pages as though he were reading a menu that didn't contain the dish he wanted. His calm was more frightening than any rage. Then he closed the file, raised his head, and looked at Preston. He only looked. It lasted a few seconds, but those seconds stretched like a sentence being silently read aloud. The emotionless eyes of the head of the Gallagher family rested upon the financial advisor who sat across the table with a strained smile, and beneath that gaze, Preston's smile slowly faded like a candle before the wind. He didn't understand why. He only felt cold. Then Ronan looked away from him as casually as though he had never looked at him at all, and turned toward his sister. "Tessa," he said, his voice no louder than the burning candles but clear in every corner of the room. "You aren't protecting this family. You're protecting the image you want other people to see. Those are two different things." He rose, fastened the button of his jacket, picked up the file, and delivered his final words before walking toward the door through which Sadie had disappeared. "And tonight, you sacrificed something real to preserve something false." The door closed for the second time, leaving behind a ruined dinner no one had touched. A bride seated in the middle of her victory, with a face as white as the tablecloth, and a con man wondering, while cold sweat gathered beneath his tailored suit, what those few seconds beneath Ronan Gallagher's gaze had meant. Had he been seen through, or had he merely been glanced at? And no one in that room, neither the man trembling nor the woman who believed she had won, knew that the true game had been arranged days earlier and was now only waiting for its final move. The dinner ended in silence. The Whitmores withdrew with stiffly polite wishes for a good night, while Sam escorted Patrick back to his room after the old man stopped in front of his daughter for exactly 1 second. He didn't scold her. He only looked at her, and that look carried more weight than anything he could have said. Caleb, the man who was supposed to become a husband the following day, didn't return to his room. He wandered through the resort hallway like someone walking in a dream, one moment repeating over and over inside his mind. It wasn't the file or the accusation. It was the expression on his fiancée's face when she placed those documents on the table. The cold, calculating look of someone measuring victory and defeat. He had never seen it during the 2 years they had loved each other. Or worse, perhaps he had seen it and convinced himself that he was mistaken. Tessa found him at the top of the stairs. She approached and reached for his hand. "Caleb, listen to me. I did it because..." He pulled his hand away, and the sound of his voice made her freeze. "Please don't tell me it was for the family, Tessa." He looked at her as though she had just removed a mask. "You hired an investigator to dig into your brother's guest. You took private documents about a woman's life and chose the most crowded dinner possible to reveal them. You could have spoken privately with Ronan, with your father, or with me. You had 100 discreet ways to handle it, but you chose the most public and the most cruel because you didn't want to warn her. You wanted to destroy her in front of everyone." Tessa stepped back. "I was protecting our wedding." "No." Caleb shook his head, and his next words fell like stones. "You were protecting your image. Your brother was right about every word." He leaned against the railing, covered his face with both hands for a moment, then looked up, and the fear inside him finally found its voice. "I'm supposed to marry you tomorrow, Tessa, and tonight I discovered that the woman I'm marrying can hire someone to dig through another person's life and execute her at the dinner table without letting her hand tremble. So I have to ask myself, what happens if one day you investigate me, or the children we may have? What happens if they embarrass you in front of the world you worship? What will you do to them?" Tessa stood there, her lips moving without sound, because every defense she had prepared shattered beneath that question. Caleb walked away, descended the stairs, left the building, and headed toward the sound of the waves. That night, the beach held only the wind and the late moon. Caleb walked a long way along the water's edge until he saw a figure seated on a low, rocky ledge, her deep blue gown blending into the darkness. He recognized the woman who, by every reasonable expectation, should have been packing her belongings and leaving that place before morning. Sadie didn't turn when he approached. She only said softly, "You should get some sleep." A groom with dark circles under his eyes will ruin the wedding photographs. Caleb sat on the rock beside her, and amid the sound of the waves, the things he couldn't say to anyone else spilled out before the person he least expected. I don't know whether tomorrow should happen anymore. Sadie turned to look at him. Tonight, I saw a Tessa I didn't recognize, he said, staring out at the black ocean. And I'm afraid that person is the real one, and the woman I've loved for 2 years has only been playing a part. Waves struck the rocks for several moments before Sadie spoke, and what she said made Caleb turn sharply toward her. She isn't cruel. He stared at her as though he couldn't believe what he had heard. You're defending the woman who just humiliated you in front of both families? I'm not defending her. Sadie shook her head. I can simply see her because I've stood in the darkness, and from there, some things are clearer. She isn't cruel, Caleb. She's afraid. You were born in the light, so you don't understand the hunger of someone who has had to climb out of the darkness by herself. I do. Frightened people do cruel things not because they enjoy them, but because they believe that if they loosen their grip for even 1 second, the entire world will collapse on top of them. Tonight, she wasn't striking at me. She was fighting the ghost inside her own mind. The vision of Boston's upper class turning its back on her. I merely happened to be standing in the path of the bullet. Caleb remained silent for a very long time, before asking in a roughened voice, How can you think that way after what she did to you? Sadie answered with the voice of someone who had paid dearly for every word she spoke. Because I've lost everything, and I know that a person isn't the worst moment of their life. The whole city once defined me by the lowest point I had ever reached. For 3 years, I was only a homeless woman in the eyes of the people who passed me. No one cared to ask who I had once been, or who I might still become. She looked directly into the groom's eyes. So I'm asking you not to do that to her. Don't abandon the person you love because of the worst moment of her life. Tomorrow, don't marry the bride you saw tonight. Marry the woman you've loved for the past 2 years. Then remain beside her long enough to help her understand that even if she loses the approval of all Boston, there will still be one person who doesn't turn away. That is what can heal fear, not a perfect wedding. The sea wind passed through the long silence between them. Caleb lowered his head, and when he raised it again, his eyes were red but calm. Thank you, he said. My family owes you an apology, and I owe you far more than that. He rose and walked back toward the resort, and neither of them knew that only about 10 paces away, hidden behind a tall, rocky outcrop, a third person had been standing there for a long time. Tessa had gone searching for her groom to finish the apology she had been unable to speak, and fate arranged for her to hear everything from the beginning. She heard the woman she had just executed at the dinner table sitting in the cold night and speaking in her defense, excusing her, protecting the man Tessa had nearly lost. The bride stood in the darkness with both hands pressed tightly over her mouth, tears streaming through her fingers, and something inside her, the fortress of appearances she had spent 2 years building, developed its first crack that night. When Sadie was finally alone on the beach, the sound of familiar footsteps came across the sand. Ronan had searched the entire resort for her, and when he saw her silhouette on the rocky ledge, he had already prepared every word he might need to persuade her to stay. His car was ready to take her back to Boston immediately if that was what she wanted, or anywhere else. He would understand if she didn't wish to look at his family for another hour. He sat in the place Caleb had just left and spoke in a voice heavy with regret. I'm sorry. For my sister, for the dinner, for everything. You don't have to remain until morning. I can take you away right now. Sadie looked at the most powerful man in Boston bowing his head and apologizing to her on a dark beach. And suddenly she smiled, the first smile she had given since the dining room door opened. Do you remember what I promised you? She asked. I said I would accompany you through an entire wedding. She shook her head and looked toward the horizon, where the first light of morning was beginning to appear. But forget the promise. I'm not staying because of it anymore. Your sister is getting married tomorrow, and you shouldn't have to stand there alone. Ronan turned and looked at her for a long time. The woman his family had wounded so deeply was still sitting there in the cold wind, choosing to remain because she didn't want him to be alone, and inside his chest, the ice that hadn't melted in 15 years quietly broke apart a little more. He didn't thank her. Things like this were beyond the reach of the words thank you. He only removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders as he had on that rainy night, and the two of them sat there together, waiting for dawn. Neither of them knew that inside the building behind them, another man also remained awake throughout the night, not because of remorse, but because he was desperately preparing an escape from a game in which he had begun to suspect he was no longer the one dealing the cards. Earlier that night, while darkness still lay heavily over the resort and the wreckage of the dinner had only just been cleared away in silence, a room on one of the upper floors remained brightly lit. Ronan stood behind the desk in the suite reserved for the groom's family, his suit jacket draped over a chair and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. Across from him stood Miles, who had driven all the way from Boston the moment he received a call containing only 5 words after dinner, carrying a leather briefcase against his chest as though it held a bomb. In truth, that was exactly what it held. Everything is ready. Miles placed the case on the desk, unlocked it, and removed 3 neatly arranged files. The prosecutor's office has confirmed receipt of the first 2 deliveries. They're only waiting for this final package and your signature as the source providing the evidence. He pushed the papers toward Ronan, and while his employer turned through each page for one final inspection, Miles stood looking out at the dark window and continued in the voice of a man who still couldn't quite believe what he had uncovered. I've been doing this work for 12 years, and I've never seen a target bind himself this securely. We traced the chain backward from the investigation firm, and the final piece fell into place the day before yesterday. Every figure in the file used to smear her matches, down to the last decimal point, the database that only one person inside the Whitmore office had permission to access. But you already know that part. What you don't know is in the 3rd file. Miles tapped the thickest folder with one finger. The money he stole from her years ago never remained still. He was clever. He didn't spend it or buy anything with it. He kept it moving through 3 layers of shell companies. Then, more than a year ago, after working his way into the Whitmore office, he began mixing it into the funds he managed for them to complete the final stage of laundering it. But once he started reaching into those funds, he couldn't stop. Look at page 17. He's been stealing from the Whitmores themselves, slowly and carefully, taking a little each month like termites eating through the beams of a house. Your sister's future family has been sheltering the very snake that once bit Sadie, and they call him their savior. Ronan turned to page 17 and remained there for a long time, and Miles watched his employer's jaw tighten. Throughout the days since the first reports arrived from 3 different sources, Ronan had been living 2 separate lives. During the day, he sat in the armchair listening to the piano like a man falling in love. At night, he stood inside his office like a general arranging a battlefield, holding quiet meetings with the prosecutor's office through attorneys, sending evidence in carefully divided packages, all under absolute secrecy. It wasn't until dinner that evening, when his own sister threw the file onto the table, that he understood the hidden hand had unwittingly turned a member of his family into its weapon. Tessa's file was the only part that hadn't been included in his calculations, but the man behind it had been, and that was why Ronan had only looked at Preston for a few seconds before turning away. A man didn't shout at a fish already trapped inside the net. He simply watched it struggle. After signing the final page, Ronan closed the pen, and Miles gathered the documents back into the briefcase, but he didn't lock it immediately. He remained standing there, hesitating in the manner of someone about to say what he had been turning over in his mind throughout the entire drive down the highway. Before I take this away, let me ask you one last time. He looked directly at his employer. Do we handle him our way? The question fell into the room, and silence followed. Both men understood exactly what it meant. There was no need for prosecutors, no need for a courtroom, and no need to wait. All it would take was one nod, and before dawn, the man sleeping in the western guest wing would disappear from Cape Cod, from Boston, from every map in existence, quietly and cleanly, with justice delivered according to the old law that had kept this family alive through 3 generations. It would be faster, Miles said softly. More certain, and honestly, after what he did to her tonight, I'd like permission to handle it myself. Ronan didn't answer immediately. He picked up the untouched glass of whiskey and walked toward the large window overlooking the sea. Far below, on a low rocky ledge at the end of the beach, he saw her. Sadie sat alone in her deep blue gown amid the night wind, her back straight, refusing to collapse, the woman who had just been publicly executed before 2 families without shedding a single tear in front of anyone. He stood there looking at the way she sat for so long that Miles began to think he had forgotten the question. Then he spoke without taking his eyes from the figure below. No, Miles blinked. No? No, Ronan repeated, and this time he turned fully around. Let me tell you why. For 15 years, We've dealt with every problem our way. Fast, clean, and as you said, certain. But look at her. He gestured toward the window. That man took her career, her money, her home, and the last family she had in this world. He drove her all the way down to the pavement, yet during 3 years at the bottom, she never stole a single dollar from anyone. She never lied to obtain a meal. Tonight, she was stabbed in the middle of a dinner table, and she still stood up and congratulated the wedding of the woman who stabbed her. She lost everything because of him, and still chose to live with decency. His voice slowed, each word becoming as heavy as stone. So what right do we have to act in her name and settle this in a way that would make her lower her head if she ever discovered the truth? No, Miles. That man has spent his entire life living in darkness, hiding in darkness, and building his fortune in darkness. His greatest punishment isn't disappearing into darkness. It's being dragged into the light, in the middle of the day, by the very law he believed he had bought, before the eyes of the decent people he deceived. She deserves to watch justice happen in a way she can speak about with her head held high. He set down the glass and ended the discussion in the voice that closed every door to argument. Take the final evidence package tonight. Before the ceremony tomorrow morning, I want confirmation from the prosecutor's office. At the wedding, no one touches a single hair on his head. Let him smile, pour wine, and shake hands. Let him believe he has won one more game. Miles looked at his employer for a long time. Then he did something he hadn't done once in 12 years. He bowed his head deeply, not in the manner of a subordinate before a crime lord, but as one man standing before another man greater than himself. This afternoon, you told me to find out why you've changed so much since she came into your life, he said as he lifted the briefcase and walked toward the door. There's no need to investigate anymore. I understand now. The door closed behind him, while Ronan remained beside the window for another minute, looking down at the rocky ledge where Sadie still sat alone with the wind. Then he reached for the coat, draped across the chair, and went down to the beach, walking toward the woman he had owed for 15 years and would spend the rest of his life repaying, carrying an apology on behalf of his family, while leaving behind him, locked inside that brightly lit room, the secret that the game had ended long ago, and only the fish trapped in the net still didn't know that the water was receding. The following morning, the Cape Cod sky was clear and blue, as though no storm had passed through the lives beneath the roof of that resort the night before. The wedding ceremony was held on the lawn overlooking the sea, with white flowers arranged along the aisle, and when the opening music began, 2 little girls from the Whitmore family came out in spotless white dresses, scattering petals. Halfway down the red carpet, both of them forgot everything they had rehearsed, grabbed each other's hands, and ran straight toward the front, throwing petals everywhere as their bright giggles rang across the lawn. Every guest burst into laughter and applause. Mr. Whitmore laughed louder than anyone, and even the nervous bride waiting behind the curtain couldn't help laughing, which eased some of her trembling. Tessa stepped out as the music played, beautiful and pale, the sleepless night leaving shadows beneath her eyes that no layer of makeup could fully hide. And all the way down the aisle, her gaze kept returning to one place, where her brother stood in the front row, and beside him, dressed in deep blue, was the woman Tessa had been certain she would never have to see again. Sadie stood with her back straight, looking at the bride without the slightest trace of resentment in her eyes. Tessa nearly stumbled for a single step. The ceremony unfolded without interruption. Vows were spoken, rings were exchanged, and when the couple kissed beneath a wave of applause, none of the guests knew that the bride was crying more than a joyful bride normally would. Only 3 people in the front row understood where those tears truly came from. By late afternoon, the families with young children began leaving early. The 2 little flower girls were carried to the car by their parents, still turning back to wave at the bride, while the evening reception inside the grand hall was left entirely to the adults. Boston's political and business elite had gathered beneath the chandeliers. Wine flowed, handshakes crossed one another, and among the crowd, Preston moved tirelessly from one group to the next in a new suit with a restored smile. After his sleepless night, he had regained his composure and convinced himself that the shock at dinner had passed without consequence, that the woman had either fled the resort or no longer had the courage to open her mouth, and that Ronan Gallagher's stare the night before had only been the look of a powerful man whose dinner had been spoiled. He poured wine for the ladies, told jokes to senators, strengthened several new business connections, the termite continuing to hollow out the beams during the homeowner's own celebration. Then the problem occurred midway through the reception. The orchestra director approached the hosts and whispered apologetically that their pianist had suffered a sudden health issue and couldn't continue, while the bride and groom's first dance had not yet taken place. The grand piano in the center of the stage suddenly became the largest empty space in the hall. Murmurs began to spread, and just as Mrs. Whitmore and her husband were discussing how to rescue the program, her gaze moved across the crowd and stopped on the woman in the deep blue gown standing beside Ronan near the windows. All day, Mrs. Whitmore had intended to approach that woman and offer a kind word after what had happened the night before, but she had never found the right moment. Now, seeing the woman's profile beneath the chandelier light, a memory from 10 years earlier suddenly rose inside the mind of one of the greatest lovers of classical music in Boston society. She crossed the room so quickly that her husband couldn't call after her in time, stopped directly in front of Sadie, stared at her, then exclaimed loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear, "Good heavens! I knew I had seen you somewhere before. You're Sadie Lawson, aren't you? The pianist from Symphony Hall." That entire corner of the hall fell silent. Sadie stood motionless, and Mrs. Whitmore took both of her hands, her voice trembling with genuine excitement. "That season, I sat in the third row. Every piece you played made the whole hall hold its breath. My husband can confirm it. I went home and told him that within 10 years, the entire country would know that young woman's name. Then suddenly, you disappeared. There were no more performances. I kept asking about you, but no one knew where you had gone." The whispers now spread throughout the grand hall like fire meeting wind. Heads leaned together. Sadie Lawson, Symphony Hall. The name that had appeared in the file the night before was now being spoken aloud by the hostess herself in the voice of an admirer, and at the far end of the room, Preston stood frozen with his wineglass halfway to his lips, the blood in his veins seeming to turn cold inch by inch. Mrs. Whitmore, still holding Sadie's hands, suddenly thought of what the entire hall had already begun to imagine. She looked toward the empty piano on the stage, then back at Sadie, her expression both pleading and hesitant. "I know this is sudden, and after everything, I have no right to ask this of you. But if, only if, you still wish to touch the keys, then tonight that place is waiting for exactly someone like you." The entire hall fell silent and waited. Sadie looked at the grand piano in the center of the stage. 3 years earlier, she had believed her life would never again allow her to sit before an instrument like that. Then she turned toward Ronan, and the man said nothing. He only gave a slight nod, the nod of someone who had listened to her play every evening and understood better than anyone what those hands had been born to do. She walked onto the stage beneath hundreds of watchful eyes, sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. The first notes of 6 a.m. fell into the hall, clear as drops of water upon the surface of a still lake, and the restless crowd of powerful people slowly grew quiet, quieter and quieter, until only the piano remained. She played the music of her life. The opening was lonely, like misty mornings beneath the church portico. The middle softened like the warmth of a paper bag being placed on the stone beside her. Then the melody rose, carrying loss, forgiveness, and rebirth within it, and people saw Mrs. Whitmore lift a handkerchief to her eyes. They saw Patrick sitting upright like a statue, while his lips silently formed the name of his late wife. They saw the bride, Tessa, clutching the groom's hand as tears streamed down her face without any attempt to hide them. And they saw Ronan Gallagher standing motionless in the center of the hall, looking at the woman on the stage as though all 15 years of his life were finally being given a voice. The final chord fell away. 1 second of absolute silence followed. Then the grand hall erupted. Applause rose like waves, and people stood to their feet. Amid that surge of bodies, almost no one noticed the large doors at the far end of the hall opening as 2 men in gray civilian suits entered, exchanged a brief word with Sam at the entrance, then walked directly toward Preston, who stood frozen in place. There were no handcuffs and no raised voices. One man showed him an official identification card, while the other spoke several quiet words into his ear. And beneath the chandelier light, the financial advisor's face changed from white to gray. He looked around for an escape route, for a face that might save him, but the entire hall had its back turned toward him. Hundreds of people were still applauding the woman on the stage, applauding a talent that no file could ever stain. And so the man set his wineglass on the edge of a table, lowered his head, and walked between the 2 officers toward the door, quietly and without resistance, disappearing from the reception in the same way he had once disappeared from Sadie's life 3 years earlier, with one difference. This time, Freedom wasn't waiting for him on the other side. The news spread through the grand hall the way all news traveled in high society, whispered from one table to the next, and in less than half an hour, after several discreet phone calls from Mr. Whitmore to the prosecutor's office, the first pieces of the truth reached both families. Their trusted financial advisor had been detained for fraud and embezzlement. His list of victims stretched across many years, and among them was a pianist he had deceived so completely that she had lost even the roof over her head. The documents used to accuse her 3 years earlier, along with the entire file that had appeared only the previous week, had all been fabricated by his own hand. Mr. Whitmore had to sit down when he heard it, his face turning pale as he understood that the snake had been living inside his office for more than a year. Mrs. Whitmore began to cry in the middle of the hall when the pieces finally came together. Dear God, that poor child sat among us last night while the very man who destroyed her stood up and testified against her, and she didn't say a single word to save herself. But the person who remained frozen the longest was the bride. Tessa stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand still held by the groom, listening as each fragment of truth fell into place, and every one of them cut into her like a blade. The file she had paid to obtain had been prepared by the thief himself. Her obsession with appearances had become a knife another man had placed in her hand. She had taken the lies of a criminal and, in the name of family honor, driven them into the only person in that room who had been entirely innocent, the same woman who had sat on the cold rocks the night before, defending Tessa, protecting the marriage Tessa had nearly destroyed, and keeping beside her the husband who had almost walked away. She looked toward the windows at the far end of the hall, where Sadie stood beside her brother amid a circle of well-wishers, and Caleb followed his wife's gaze and gently tightened his hand around hers. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He had said enough the night before. What came next was hers to do alone. Tessa drew a long breath, released her husband's hand, and walked through the crowd in her wedding gown, one step at a time, crossing the shortest and longest distance of her life. The people gathered around Sadie parted automatically when they saw the bride approaching. Someone even assumed she was coming to offer congratulations. Only Ronan subtly shifted his stance, a protective reflex that had already become instinct. But Sadie lightly touched his sleeve. It's all right. Tessa stopped before them, and in front of dozens of curious eyes from Boston society, the bride did something no one expected. She lowered her head. Miss Sadie. Her voice broke on the first 2 words. I'm not asking you to forgive me yet. I haven't earned that. I'm only asking you to listen to me once, here, in front of everyone, because I humiliated you in front of everyone. That corner of the hall fell silent, and wine glasses stopped midway to waiting lips. I've been afraid my entire life, Tessa said, tears streaming through her bridal makeup, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. Afraid that people would look at me and see only the Gallagher girl. Afraid I would never be clean enough, elegant enough, or worthy enough. So I polished the outside of myself at any cost. And last night, to protect that appearance, I did something no decent family should ever do. I tormented a guest at my own table. She raised her eyes to Sadie. I confused appearances with honor. Appearances are what other people see. Honor is what we do when no one is watching. You spent 3 years beneath a church portico and never lost your honor, while I stood surrounded by silk and crystal and threw mine away during a single dinner. Her voice caught, and I almost used the truth of a liar to destroy an honest woman. Last night on the beach, I stood in the darkness and heard everything. After the way I treated you, you still protected my marriage for me. You taught me the difference between appearances and honor without needing to say a single word. She raised both hands to cover her face. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. Sadie remained still for one heartbeat, then did something that made even the most experienced women in Boston society blink back tears. She stepped forward, gently lowered the bride's hands from her tear-soaked face, and embraced Tessa. Truly embraced her, with the firm arms of an older sister. I accept your apology, she whispered beside the bride's ear. And I'll tell you a secret. For the past 3 years, there has only been one thing I wanted, for someone to look at me as a human being again. Tonight, you gave me that in front of 100 people. So let's call it even. Tessa began sobbing in her arms like a child. Every year she had spent forcing herself to remain strong, finally breaking apart. Caleb stood behind them, watching the 2 women, watching his new wife finally allow herself to collapse in front of another person. He stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, and when Tessa turned, He took her hand and laced their fingers tightly together, a touch that said the fracture from the night before had begun to heal, not because they had pretended to forget, but because the truth had finally been spoken beneath the open light of day. At that very moment, the soft tap of a cane sounded against the floor, followed by someone calling loudly, "Everyone, the elder Mr. Gallagher would like to say a few words." The crowd turned. Patrick had risen from the head table, one hand resting on his cane, and the other lifting a glass of wine, and the entire hall slowly quieted to hear the man more than half of them had once dared to mention only in lowered voices. "I'm an old man now," he began, his voice deep and carrying clearly through the room. "If I speak too long, I'm afraid I'll spoil everyone's celebration, so I'll ask for only 1 minute. Today, I gave my daughter away and joined my family with a respected one. That is a blessing. But the greater blessing," his gaze moved slowly across his daughter holding her husband's hand, then to his son standing beside the woman in the deep blue gown, "is that tonight I watched my children do things neither power nor money can buy. One found the courage to bow her head and admit her wrong before 100 people. The other found the courage to give his heart to what is good. And this house has welcomed back a piece of music we had been missing for 15 years. He raised his glass higher, and his final words descended through the grand hall slowly, one by one, as though being carved into stone. "This family once made all of Boston afraid, but tonight, for the first time, it has made its father proud." The entire hall raised their glasses, and the sound of crystal touching crystal rang like small bells. Amid tear-bright eyes and quiet smiles, no one noticed one very subtle thing. Ronan Gallagher, the man who had never revealed anything before a crowd, reached for Sadie's hand within the folds of her blue gown, and for the first time, beneath the open light of day, the fingers of the two loneliest people in Boston intertwined without hiding from anyone. A few weeks after the wedding, autumn arrived in Boston, and inside the greenhouse of the Gallagher estate, the white chrysanthemums bloomed more brilliantly than they had at any time in the past 15 years. The story of the con man had now been reduced to brief lines in the newspapers. A trial awaited him, supported by complete evidence, and his former victims were being contacted one by one. Among the legal documents delivered to the guest house was a notice that left Sadie sitting in silence for a very long time. The debts placed in her name years earlier had officially been confirmed as the result of fraud. Her name was clean again, as clean as though no one had ever dragged it through the mud. She carried that paper across the garden and entered the greenhouse, then sat among the flower beds belonging to the late mother she had never met. There, on an afternoon when sunlight slanted through the old panes of glass, she opened the leather notebook with its worn spine, looked at the empty staff on the final page, and for the first time in 3 years, she knew exactly what the missing notes were. They had been there all along, in the 6 o'clock bells of St. Brendan Church, in the steady rhythm of footsteps upon the stone, and in the warmth of a paper bag. She simply hadn't been healed enough to hear them before. She wrote without stopping until the sunlight faded, and beneath the final staff, she carefully wrote the title of the piece, 6 a.m., 6 o'clock in the morning. That evening, after dinner, she said to Ronan in a voice that tried to sound ordinary, while her hands clutched the notebook tightly, "It's finished. Do you still want to hear it?" The man set down his coffee cup, looked at her for a moment, then rose and walked ahead toward the room with the piano. Sadie followed, her heart beating as it had on the first night she touched those dust-covered keys. This time, the room was different. The white cloth was gone. The piano had been tuned and polished until it gleamed, and a vase of white chrysanthemums arranged by Ruth rested on top. Ronan sat in the familiar armchair positioned at an angle from the piano, the place where he had spent so many evenings listening. Sadie placed the notebook on the music stand, drew a deep breath, and began to play. The piece opened with clear, single notes, like drops of water, moved through the rising phrase that fell away like a sigh, the passage he had carried within him since he was 19, without ever knowing its name. But this time, the melody didn't stop where it had always remained unfinished. It continued, passing through deep, low measures like the bottom of an abyss, then slowly, step by step, growing brighter and warmer, like mist lifting from the old streets, like one hand finally finding another. When the final chord sounded and gradually faded into the quiet room, it didn't leave behind an emptiness, as it always had before. It left the piece of something finally made complete. Sadie remained motionless on the piano bench, afraid to turn around. Then she heard him rise, and heard his footsteps approaching. And when she turned, Ronan was standing directly beside her, the most silent man in Boston, looking at her with eyes she had learned to understand over the months. "I heard it for the first time when I was 19, he said, his voice deep and slow. "That night, I thought my whole life was collapsing, and a child somewhere across the alley held me up without even knowing it. I heard it for the second time beneath the church portico, coming from a woman the entire city passed as though she were a lamppost, and I realized that the greatest debt of my life was sitting right in front of me." He took her hand, the hand that had once been calloused and was now beginning to heal, and held it between both of his palms. "Tonight, I've heard it for the third time, and now it's finished. You've healed. The debt has been repaid. Everything could end here and still feel complete. But I don't want it to end." He lowered himself onto one knee on the wooden floor, before his mother's piano, inside the home of his family, and from the inner pocket of his jacket, he took out a ring that was surprisingly simple for a man who could buy an entire city. "Sadie Lawson, I've given away thousands of paper bags in my life. You're the only person who ever gave me a home in return. Stay here, not in the guest house anymore, but in my life. Will you become my wife?" Sadie looked at the man kneeling before her, and years of memories passed through her eyes. The cold church portico, the warm paper bag, the rainy night and the bowl of clam chowder, the greenhouse, the piano, and the beach at Cape Cod. Then she began to laugh as tears fell, a bright and clear laugh untouched by even a speck of the past, the first complete smile she had given in 3 years, perhaps in her entire life. And she nodded. "I'll stay," she said. "I'll stay home." The following morning, while Boston was still submerged in mist, the familiar black car once again parked in front of the portico of St. Brendan Church at exactly 6 o'clock, but this time, both doors opened. Ronan carried a large basket, while Sadie held a stack of paper bags still warm from the bread Ruth had just baked. And together they walked along the portico where people still lay curled beneath old blankets. They gently placed a bag beside each person without waking anyone and without waiting to be thanked. Attached to every paper bag was a small white card bearing a simple sentence Sadie had chosen herself: "You are still seen." After placing the final bag, she stood upright and looked toward the second-floor window of the church, which was slowly brightening in the morning sunlight. Ronan came to stand beside her and took her hand, and the two loneliest people the city had ever known stood silently beneath the stone portico where everything had begun. Because in the end, this story only wishes to say one simple thing: a person's worth is never determined by where they sleep tonight, but by what they preserve inside their heart after they have lost everything. And quiet kindness, the kind that needs no recognition and asks for nothing in return, is the seed that blooms latest yet endures longest. Plant it today, and perhaps it won't blossom for another 15 years. But when it finally does, it may carry enough warmth to comfort an entire lifetime. If you believe that quiet kindness will one day be rewarded, please press like and share this story with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more captivating and heartfelt stories every day. And what did you think of this story? Which moment touched you most deeply? Please share your thoughts in the comments below so we can hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.